Hey students, today we're going to be covering Chapter 29 on the election of Woodrow Wilson and the beginnings of the First World War. Roosevelt would separate from the Republican Party and form his own third party known as the Bull Moose Party. Roosevelt would continue the campaign on his progressive platform and expand upon it. He would garner support from women who could not vote at this time. Supporting women's suffrage, Roosevelt would also support a broad social welfare system with minimum wage and social insurance. This would be Roosevelt's new nationalism program. Taft would rail against Roosevelt, calling him a dangerous egotist and demagogue, to which Roosevelt responded with calling Taft a fathead with a brain of a guinea pig. The Republican establishment was fighting against Roosevelt so much that this allowed the Democrats to better organize and campaign. The Democrats would choose academic Woodrow Wilson as their nominee. Wilson would campaign on the New Freedom Program. This called for stronger enforcement of antitrust laws, banking reform, and tariff reductions. Wilson had a clear path to victory. The people of the United States had the extremes of the Republican Party, the old pro-business, anti-labor Republicans with Taft, and the progressive borderline socialist Roosevelt. The Democrats appeared to be a balanced choice. The Democrats at this time were limited government intervention in business with enforcement of antitrust laws. Democrats were anti-socialists and believed in competition in the market with self-made man ideas. It was because of the divide with the Republican Party that Wilson would win the 1812 election with 435 electoral votes. Wilson was a unique president for his time. He was highly educated. He was a highly educated idealist coming from post-Civil War South with deep Christian beliefs. It was said that his two favorite books were the Bible and the dictionary. Wilson's academic prowess was matched by his arrogance against those he believed to be lesser minds. Wilson would assume office with the idea that the president was the head of the government and had to lead as a result. He would lead Congress against tariffs, banks, and big trusts. Wilson would launch his assault with what he called the triple walls of privilege. Wilson would lead Congress to pass the Underwood tariff that drastically reduced the import fees for imports. Wilson would also lead the American public against the outcry of business lobbyists and claim victory. Wilson would also lead the charge for the ratification of the 19th Amendment, introducing a graduated income tax on incomes over $3,000. Next on Wilson's list was the banks. In 1908, Congress launched an investigation in the banks, and after 3 years, the findings recommended a national bank with many branches throughout the nation. Wilson took the advice of the commission and signed into law the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, establishing the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve had sole authority over the money supply of the nation and would keep the support of the nation through the upcoming years of the First World War. Wilson's final assault would be on the trusts. In 1914, Congress would pass the Federal Trade Commissions Act. This established a commission to check for unfair trade practices and prevent the creation of monopolies. Wilson would prove that he meant business with the progressive movement. He would lead the charge to change labor laws to reduce working hours, provide worker protection, and provide financial access to struggling industries such as farming. Wilson would nominate the first Jewish justice, Louis Brandeis, to the Supreme Court. Wilson does fall short on the expansion of representation for African Americans and further the cause for segregation. Wilson would move away from Taft and Roosevelt approach to foreign policy. Wilson did not approve of imperialism, and he did not trust Wall Street businessmen. Wilson, only a week into his presidency, announced that he would end dollar diplomacy and remove special programs for American investors. Wilson would remove tolls for American vessels for the Panama Canal and sign into law the Jones Act in 1916. It granted the Philippines the status of territory, but Wilson feared that this would be a future thorn in the side of the United States. This was fueled by his Southern racism and anti-imperialist views. Wilson would implement the walk softly portion of Roosevelt's foreign policy when trouble with Japan arose because of Californian segregation of the Japanese again. They were forbidding Japanese to be able to purchase land. Wilson would send his Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, to Californian legislators to back off their racist policy. Wilson would have to resort to the big stick policy when Haiti threatened American interests and sent Marines that remained in Haiti for 19 years. Wilson's ideals in foreign policy would be challenged by a revolution-bound Mexico. The border had been unstable in recent years and started to spill over to the United States. In 1913, the president of Mexico, Francisco Maduro, was murdered by General Victoriano Huerta and would be installed into power. Wilson refused to implement dollar diplomacy and did not want to intervene militarily. Wilson wanted to morally shame Mexico into submission. But this was unsuccessful, and he had to resort to supporting Huerta's rivals, Vicentiano Carones and unstable Francisco Pancho Villa, with guns and ammunition. This was still not enough. In 1914, American sailors would be arrested in the port city of Tampico. Wilson could not ignore this action. He would go to Congress to receive authorization to intervene. Prior to being able to get that authorization, Wilson's hand was forced to move. A German vessel was inbound to deliver arms to Huerta's forces. Wilson would order the Navy to seize the port of Veracruz to prevent Huerta from receiving help from the European agitator. Huerta would fall from power later in 1914, and Carranza would assume the office. Mexico would remain restless for years to come. In 1916, Pancho Villa would murder 16 Americans and later would cross the border to murder 19 more. Villa was hoping that the United States and Mexico would go to war over the incident. This did not come, but Wilson did send General John Pershing to chase Villa deep into Mexico. Villa's men would be killed and dispersed, but Villa himself would escape. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, the European powers were at each other's throats and starting the greatest conflict of history during this time. The belligerents were the Central Powers and the Allies. The Central Power members were Germany and Austria-Hungary, Turkey, and Bulgaria. The Allies were France, Britain, Russia, Japan, Italy, and eventually the United States. Wilson did not want the United States to join the war and would declare neutrality. Both sides attempted to woo the United States, but a majority of Americans were anti-Central Powers. Americans saw old autocratic European arrogance at the sight of German Kaiser Wilhelm. This intensified when Central Power agents were caught in a conspiracy to sabotage American industry. Wilson would encourage Americans not to take sides and remain out of the fight. Wilson would be hard-nosed about staying out of the fight despite egregious actions against the United States by the Germans. The United States would still trade with both the Allies and the Central Powers, though throughout the conflict, Berlin would protest that the United States was favoring the Allies with the massive financial support from Wall Street bankers, when in reality the United States could not get any trade vessels to Germany. The Old Lion was determined to starve Germany out of trade and would forbid vessels from reaching German ports, with Navy patrols and sea mines in those trade routes. Germany would respond with a new weapon that would put the world on edge. The German Navy created submarines, nicknamed U-boats from the German title Unterseeboot. Germany promised the world that it would not sink neutral vessels, but said that mistakes may happen. In 1915, the British passenger liner Lusitania would be sunk off the coast of Ireland, bringing down with her over 1,000 souls, including 128 Americans. The United States public was seething, but Wilson did not ready the American military. Wilson would instead force the Germans to promise not to sink passenger ships without warning. This is after another ship was sunk, killing 2 additional Americans. Well, surprise, in 1916, the Germans would sink the French vessel the Sussex. Without warning, Wilson was now super serious and threatened to end diplomatic relations with Germany if they did it again. But in this agreement, the Germans wanted the United States to get Britain to end their blockade. In the election of 1916, Wilson would win re-election based on his anti-war policy and keeping Americans at large out of the threat of war. Rough Rider Roosevelt was mad as hell at Wilson and his anti-war platform. Roosevelt did not want to split the Republican ticket again and would not run for the presidency, but instead would give out scorching speeches at Wilson's expense. In the end, Wilson would win 277 electoral votes to Charles Hughes' 254. The nation was split on the war issue, but remained with the peace of Wilson. This would be shattered shortly into Wilson's second term. Alright, students, that is the conclusion of Chapter 29. Please be sure to follow the CDC recommendations. Wash your hands, do not touch your face, and do not go outside. If you are still watching, the key word is saints. This will come up in your quiz. Remember, the key word is saints.